The evening air was calm, carrying the smell of freshly cut grass and distant wood smoke. In the small village of Elmswood, life moved slowly. Children played with wooden toys in the dirt roads. Old men at outside tea stalls, talking about the harvest and the weather. Daniel walked home with tired steps. His boots were dusty and his shirt clung to him from the day's work in the fields. But even in his tiredness, he noticed the sky. It was painted in soft strokes of orange and gold, as if the heavens themselves were calming the earth before nightfall. His home was a small wooden hut, built by his father many years ago. The walls were worn, the roof patched in several places. But to Daniel, it was more than just a house, it was the place that held every memory of his childhood. Outside the door sat his mother, Grace. Her hair had turned more silver than brown over the years, and fine wrinkles traced the corners of her eyes. But her smile was as warm as the day he was born. "Daniel," she called, her voice gentle, "you're late today." "I stayed a little longer in the field," he replied, setting down his tools. He kissed her forehead before sitting beside her. "You didn't wait for me to have tea, did you?" "I did," she said with a smile, pouring tea into 2 cups. They drank in silence, watching the last light of the day fade. Daniel loved these moments. No rush, no noise, just the comfort of his mother's presence. The next morning, while returning from the well with a bucket of water, Daniel heard a familiar voice. "Daniel." He turned and saw Emily walking towards him. She was wearing a light blue dress, her long brown hair flowing behind her as the wind teased it. In her hands was a small basket covered with a white cloth. "I brought something for your mother," she said, her voice soft but cheerful. Daniel took the basket, feeling his fingers brush against hers for a brief second. It was such a small touch, but it left an unexpected warmth in his chest. "You didn't have to," Daniel said. "I wanted to," Emily replied, her smile lighting up her face. "She always gives me vegetables from your garden. I wanted to return the kindness." Daniel nodded. "She will be happy to see you." They walked together toward his home, talking about small things, the changing weather, the village festival that was coming soon, and the way the river looked in the morning sun. Daniel loved listening to her voice. It had a way of making even the simplest things feel important. When they reached the house, Grace welcomed Emily with open arms. The 2 women talked for a while as Daniel quietly prepared tea. Grace noticed the way Daniel's eyes followed Emily, and she smiled to herself. After Emily left, Grace turned to her son and said, "She's a good girl, Daniel." Daniel pretended not to understand, lowering his eyes. But inside, he knew what his mother meant. The weeks passed, and Daniel found himself meeting Emily more often. Sometimes by the river, where the water sparkled like diamonds under the sun. Sometimes on the dusty road between their homes. And sometimes without any words at all, just sitting side by side, watching the clouds drift by. They spoke of dreams. Emily dreamed of becoming a teacher. Daniel dreamed of leaving the village to work in the city and giving his mother a better life. "I hope," Emily said one evening, "that no matter where life takes us, we will never forget this place." Daniel looked at her, the fading sunlight catching in her hair. "I could never forget," he said quietly. One cold evening, Daniel noticed that his mother was coughing more than usual. At first, He thought it was just the weather. But the cough grew worse with each passing day. She became weaker, her steps slower. Daniel stayed by her side, bringing her warm soup, placing an extra blanket over her at night, and holding her hand whenever she felt too weak to move. One rainy night, as the sound of raindrops tapped gently on the roof, Grace called him closer. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice fragile. "Yes, Mother," he said, leaning close. "Promise me something." "Anything," he replied, his voice trembling. "No matter what happens, you will never give up on your dreams. And to take care of Emily." Daniel's heart tightened. "Mother, please, you will be fine." Grace smiled weakly, brushing his cheek with her hand. "I just want to hear you promise." "I promise," Daniel said, his voice breaking. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, Daniel listened only to the sound of the rain. The next morning, the village doctor came to see Grace. His face was serious. "She needs proper treatment," he told Daniel. "This is beyond what I can do here. You must take her to the city." Daniel felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had no money for such a journey. The fields barely gave enough to survive. That night, he sat outside the house, staring at the road ahead. Emily came and sat beside him, sensing his worry. "What's wrong?" she asked gently. Daniel told her everything. She listened quietly, her eyes filled with concern. "Daniel, we'll find a way," she said. "I'll help you." Her words were simple, but they gave him strength. The days ahead would test Daniel in ways he never imagined. But for now, he had a promise to keep. The next few days were filled with worry. Daniel woke early each morning, worked in the fields until his hands ached, and then returned to care for his mother. Grace's cough grew worse, and her voice grew weaker. Sometimes she smiled to make him feel better, but he could see the pain in her eyes. One evening, after bringing her a bowl of warm soup, Daniel sat at the small table with his head in his hands. He was thinking about the doctor's words. The city. He had never been there. It was far away, and everything there was expensive. But if that was the only way to save his mother, he had to try. The next day, Daniel went to the village market to sell some vegetables. He hoped to earn enough to at least start the journey. The market was busy with the smell of bread, spices, and freshly cut flowers filling the air. Daniel stood quietly in the corner, selling his small baskets of carrots and potatoes. "Daniel," a familiar voice called. He turned to see Emily, holding a basket of apples. "You're here early," she said. "I need the money," Daniel replied simply. Emily studied his face for a moment. "You're still thinking about taking your mother to the city, aren't you?" "Yes," Daniel admitted. "But I don't have enough yet." Without another word, Emily reached into her small purse and handed him a few coins. "Take this." Daniel shook his head. "No, Emily, I can't." "You can," she interrupted. "And you will. It's not charity, Daniel. It's what friends do for each other." Her voice was soft, but her eyes held a firmness that Daniel couldn't argue with. He took the coins, his throat tight with emotion. That night, Daniel counted everything he had. It was still not enough. He needed more, much more. So he made a decision. The next morning, before the sun rose, he walked to the old workshop at the edge of the village. It had once belonged to his father, who was a skilled carpenter. Inside, covered in dust, were a few pieces of wood and his father's old tools. Daniel picked up a chisel and began to work. He would make chairs, tables, anything the villagers needed and sell them. He worked late into the night. His hands blistered, his muscles aching. Emily visited often, bringing him bread, tea, and sometimes just a smile to keep him going. "I've never seen you work so hard," she said one evening, handing him a cup of tea. "I have a promise to keep," Daniel replied. Weeks passed. The furniture sold well, but time was running out. Grace's health was getting worse. One night, as Daniel sat beside her bed, she reached for his hand. "Daniel," she whispered, "don't wear yourself out for me. You are the reason I'm doing this," he said, his voice trembling. She smiled weakly. "I just want you to live a happy life." "I will," he promised. "Once you're better, I'll make sure of it." Finally, after months of hard work, Daniel saved enough money for the journey. He packed a small bag, wrapped his mother in a warm shawl, and with Emily's help, set out for the city. The journey was long and tiring. They traveled by cart for hours, the cold wind biting at their faces. Grace scoffed often and Daniel held her close, whispering that they were almost there. When they finally reached the city, Daniel was overwhelmed. Tall buildings, crowded streets, the constant sound of wheels and footsteps. It was nothing like the quiet village. The hospital was large and smelled of medicine. The doctors examined Grace carefully. "She needs to stay here for treatment," one of them said, "but it will be costly." Daniel swallowed hard. How much? The number they told him felt like a mount and far more than what he had left. That night, Daniel sat on a bench outside the hospital, staring at the ground. Emily sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his. "We'll find a way," she whispered. But Daniel didn't answer. He was thinking of the promise he had made Dee, and how hard it was becoming to keep it. The city was loud, restless, and unforgiving. For Daniel, every corner, every face was a reminder of how far he was from home. But the hospital room, with its white walls and quiet beeping machines, was the only place that mattered to him now. That was where his mother lay, her breathing shallow but steady. Every morning, Daniel would bring her flowers from the street market. He would place them by the window, hoping they would bring a bit of the village warmth into the cold room. Grace would smile, though her strength was fading. One afternoon, Daniel met with the hospital's finance officer. The man's words were blunt. "If you can't pay the full amount within 2 weeks, we will have to stop treatment." Daniel's stomach sank. 2 weeks, and he had almost nothing left. That night, sitting on a bench outside the hospital, Daniel buried his face in his hands. He thought of the promise he had made to his mother and of Emily's words. "We'll find a way." The next morning, Daniel walked through the busy streets of the city looking for work. He went from shop to shop, factory to factory, but everywhere the answer was the same: "We don't need anyone right now." Finally, he found a small construction site where men were lifting heavy stones. The foreman, a rough man with a thick beard, looked Daniel up and down. "You've got strong arms," he said. "We pay by the day, no contracts. You work, you get paid. You don't work, you get nothing." Daniel nodded. "I'll take it." The work was brutal. His hands became blistered, his back ached and dust filled his lungs. But at the end of the day, when the foreman handed him a few coins, Daniel saw something he hadn't seen in days. Hope. He worked every single day, rain or shine, sometimes skipping meals just to save more money. At night, he would return to the hospital, sit by his mother's side, and hold her hand until she fell asleep. Emily came to the hospital whenever she could. She brought homemade soup, clean clothes for Grace, and sometimes just her quiet presence. One night, as she stood by the window watching the city lights, she said softly, "Daniela, when this is over, promise me you'll take a little time for yourself." Daniel smiled faintly. "I will, but only after I've kept my promise." Emily looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her eyes, something she wasn't saying. The 2 weeks passed quickly and still Daniel didn't have enough. Desperation began to creep into his heart. One evening, he overheard two men at the construction site talking about a dangerous night job at the docks. Work that paid well but was known to break men's bodies. Daniel didn't hesitate. That night, he went to the docks. The work was backbreaking, lifting heavy crates in the cold, slippery darkness. His hands bled, his muscles screamed in pain, but he kept going. By morning, his body felt broken, but his bag was heavier with coins. It still wasn't enough, but it was closer. One evening, Emily found Daniel sitting outside the hospital, his head resting against the wall. He looked exhausted, his clothes torn, his hands raw. "You're killing yourself," she said, tears in her eyes. Daniel shook his head. "I'm keeping my promise." Emily knelt beside him, placing her hands on his. "Daniel, if you fall, who will take care of her? Who will take care of you?" Her voice cracked, and Daniel realized just how much she cared, not just for his mother, but for him. Then came the night everything changed. Daniel had been working at the docks again when a heavy crate slipped from the ropes above. It crashed down, missing him by inches but striking his leg. The pain was blinding, but all Daniel could think of was, "I can't stop. Not now." He limped back to the hospital, his leg bleeding, but with enough money in his pocket to pay for another month of his mother's treatment. When he handed the coins to the finance officer, the man counted them and nodded. "That will do it for now." Daniel went to his mother's room. Grace was awake, her eyes brighter than they had been in weeks. She reached out her hand and Daniel took it gently. "You've done so much for me," she whispered. "I told you, Mother, it's my promise." Daniel replied, forcing a smile. Grace's eyes glistened. "I love you, my son." And for the first time in many days, Daniel felt the heaviness in his chest ease, if only for a moment. The days in the city began to blur into one another. Morning meant hard labor. Evening meant sitting by his mother's side. Night meant working at the docks, carrying crates until his arms shook from exhaustion. Daniel's body was slowly breaking, but his will remained unshaken. He had promised his mother he would never give up. And to Daniel, promises were not just words. One rainy afternoon, Daniel returned to the hospital after his day's work. Emily was sitting by Grace's bed, gently wiping her forehead with a damp cloth. She looked up when Daniel entered. "She's been sleeping most of the day," Emily said softly. Daniel walked to his mother's side and took her hand. Her skin felt colder than usual. "Mother," he whispered, "I'm here." Grace's eyes fluttered open. She smiled weakly. "You've been working too much," she murmured. Daniel shook his head. "I'm doing what I must." The doctor entered the room, his expression serious. "I need to speak with you," he told Daniel. Outside in the hallway, the doctor's voice was quiet but heavy. "She's getting weaker. The medicine is helping. But her body is tired. You should prepare yourself for the possibility that she may not recover." The words hit Daniel like a knife. He stood there, staring at the floor, unable to speak. When he returned to the room, Emily was still there. She saw his face and knew something was wrong. But Daniel forced a smile, hiding the storm inside him. That night, he sat alone on a bench outside the hospital. Rain fell steadily, soaking his clothes, but he didn't care. He was thinking about the nights when he was a child, when his mother would hold him close and sing softly until he fell asleep. She had given him everything, and now he feared he was about to lose her. Emily found him there. She didn't speak at first, just sat beside him, sharing the rain and the silence. Finally, she said, "Daniel, you can't keep all this pain inside. Let me carry some of it with you." Her words were simple, but they broke something inside him. For the first time in weeks, Daniel let the tears fall. Emily held his hand, and in that moment, Daniel realized she wasn't just a part of his life. She was a part of his heart. The next morning, Daniel went back to work with even more determination. He refused to believe his mother would leave him. If hard work could save her, then he would give every drop of strength he had. Days passed, and one evening, after finishing at the docks, Daniel rushed to the hospital. But as he entered the hallway, he noticed the nurse's expression. Something was wrong. He ran to the room. Grace was lying still, her breathing shallow. Her eyes opened slowly when she heard his footsteps. "Daniel," she whispered. He was at her side in an instant, holding her hand tightly. "I'm here, Mother. Always." She smiled faintly. "Do you remember the promise?" Daniel nodded, tears already burning his eyes. "I remember. I will never give up. And I will take care of Emily." Her lips curved into the softest smile. "That's all I needed to hear." Her hand grew lighter in his grasp. Her eyes closed and her chest rose one last time, then fell still. The room was silent. Daniel sat frozen, still holding her hand, as if afraid to let go. Emily stood quietly in the corner, tears streaming down her face. After what felt like hours, Daniel finally laid his mother's hand gently on the bed. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers. "I kept my promise, Mother," he whispered through the tears. "And I always will." The day of the funeral was cold and gray. Clouds hung low over the city, and a light drizzle fell as if the sky itself was mourning with Daniel. A small group of people stood quietly around the simple wooden coffin. Emily stayed close to Daniel, holding his hand tightly. Daniel didn't cry that day. He had cried all the tears he could in the quiet of the hospital room. Now he simply stood still, his eyes fixed on the coffin, his mind replaying every moment he had shared with his mother. After the burial, Daniel and Emily returned to the small room they had been renting near the hospital. It felt tempting to empty without Grace's warm voice to fill it. That night, Daniel sat by the window, staring at the city lights. Emily brought him a cup of tea, but he didn't drink it. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "I don't know how to live without her, Emily." Emily knelt beside him, her voice gentle but steady. "You live by keeping your promise. She believed in you, Daniel, and now you're full. You have to believe in yourself." In the days that followed, Daniel kept working. Not because he had to pay hospital bills anymore, but because work was the only thing that kept him moving. He sent some money back to the village to help the children at the small school. He repaired furniture for free for old women who reminded him of his mother. Emily stayed by his side. She cooked for him when he forgot to eat, listened when he needed to speak, and stayed silent when his grief needed space. One evening, as they sat by the window watching the sunset, Daniel finally said the words he had been holding back. "Emily, you've been my strength through all of this. I don't know what I would have done without you." Emily smiled softly. "You would have survived, because that's who you are." Daniel took her hand. "I promised my mother I'd take care of you. But somewhere along the way, I realized I don't just want to take care of you. I want to spend my life with you." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "And I want the same, Daniel." Years passed. Daniel and Emily married in a small ceremony back in their village, under the same golden sky where their story had begun. They built a modest home, not far from where Grace's house once stood. Daniel started a small workshop, just like his father's, and taught young men the craft of carpentry. But no matter how busy life became, Daniel never forgot his promise. Every year on the day his mother passed, he would place fresh flowers by her grave and whisper the same words. "I kept my promise, Mother, and I always will." One evening, years later, Daniel sat on the porch of his home. The sun was setting, the sky glowing with that same warm orange and gold he remembered from his youth. Emily sat beside him, their children playing in the yard. Daniel looked at the horizon and felt a deep peace in his heart. Life had taken much from him, but it had also given him love, purpose, and the strength to keep going. He turned to Emily and smiled. "You know, I think she would be proud of us." Emily rested her head on his shoulder. "I know she is." And as the first stars appeared in the evening sky, Daniel realized that promises, the ones made with love, never truly end.